And we're live. So welcome, Steffi. Welcome, everyone. What you will watch today is a brief GDPR webinar. Steffi is very qualified to deliver this information. She has done it for many companies before. And she will introduce herself now and take us through this material. I will keep an eye on the YouTube chat. So if you have questions, just ask them there. And I will ask them to Steffi at the end of the session. So please, Steffi, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I will start to share the screen. I think that's... I hope I'm sharing the right screen. So my name is Steffi Besselink. I am a Dutch-European lawyer based currently in Helsinki in Finland. Indeed, I went completely nuts into GDPR and certified in that a while ago. And currently I'm helping startups and small, medium businesses in setting up their GDPR, any GDPR questions, consultancy, templates, trainings. And my clientele is mostly based around Finland, Estonia, Germany, Netherlands, Denmark. And today I will present the requirements for GDPR and also have some freebies to give away at the end of this. So stay tuned and yeah, let's start. I hope I shared the right one. Yes, it works. Great. So as I said, I will go through the requirements today and I will focus on the most important ones, and which are scope of the law, so when it applies to you, data types, data use, what is legal data use, data subject rights, what is considered I have secure data, how to prevent a data breach, and if you can share it. So let's start with the scope of the GDPR. As you probably know by now, it stands for General Data Protection Regulation. It is a European law that applies to all companies processing data from individuals in Europe, as well as individuals outside Europe, if your business activities are directed to the European market. And that's an important distinction I will explain in a little bit. And the GDPR rules also apply actually to individuals. And for example, there was a case quite early after the law was implemented where in the Netherlands, a grandmother was fined for posting pictures of her grandson on Facebook without consent of the mother. She thought it was her right as a grandmother. But the court said you have to still have consent from the mother. So she had to remove it. And every time she wouldn't do it, she would be fined. So how does, as I said before, how does the GDPR work in the scope of global companies? Now, if the company, for example, is based in the United States, collecting information from people that are in Europe, then the GDPR applies because of the territory is Europe. If a US company collects information from Europeans, but they're not in Europe, they are in the US. So basically same as US individuals, European individuals, any individuals, but in the US, GDPR does not apply. So the territory is Europe. Then there is an extended arm where it means if you are a European-based company with, as I said, there is a link to the European market, your activities are directed towards the European economic market, then every data that you process all around the world, all of those individuals have to be following, you have to follow the GDPR rules related to all of these individuals. It doesn't matter that this individual is then based in India or in United States or in Europe, if your business activities are focused on the European market. If you are a company that is completely focused on a market outside Europe, for example, a company based in Berlin, providing services for hotels in Florida and India only, like outside Europe, not at all focused on the European market at all, then those individuals are not following, or do not have to follow the GDPR rules. You're following then the national rules related to those individuals. So that's the scope of the law, and that's pretty important to know, I think, to understand if the rules even apply to you. But when the law comes into place is when the activity comprehend personal data. And this is also very important stuff, because if you have anonymous data in general, then there's no identity, there's no person to identify from, so there's no personal data, there's no GDPR rules. If you have personal data, it doesn't matter if it's direct identifiers, indirect identifiers, anything related to that person is personal data, and GDPR rules apply. Now, within those personal data, there is a specific category of data that is really important, and that is the special category data related to race, ethnicity, political opinions, religion, trade union membership, genetic data, biometric data for identification, genetic data, as I already said, data related to health and sexual orientation and sex life. This data is always subject to additional security, or so-called technical and organizational security measures, always. So you have to show that you have implemented those additional security measures to protect this data. Now, as I said before, the GDPR applies to personal data, and this is all data related to a person. This includes pseudonymized data, which is still personal data. Anonymous data is no GDPR data is no personal data. There can no person be identified from the count of the number of website visitors, for example. Now, pseudonymization is actually a security measure. So it means there is personal data, and we have put a pseudonymization technique that makes it so that the individual from this data set cannot be directly identified, or its symptoms or its data cannot be directly identified. It's a security measure to protect the individual from being instantly recognized. That's it. Now, there are different pseudonymization techniques. As I said, it's a security measure, so the technique that you use has to be assessed. Does it work with the type of data? For example, you want to assess, is it robust enough? Is it secure enough? The encryption, for example, has a strength of, it's encrypted with a secret key, but then the weak part is where you keep the secret key, right? Hash functions is quick and easy to implement. However, it's also very often a victim of brute force attacks. Tokenization has a similar type of working where you have a fault, and that fault becomes the single point of weakness, so to say. So it's every pseudonymization technique should be assessed to see, like, okay, is it robust? Does it keep the data secure? What's the purpose of this technique? Where do we keep then the keys? Is it still secure if we keep the keys in a specific vault separated from the earlier, from the data set? Who has access to these keys? And that's why pseudonymization technique is a security measure. It doesn't lead to anonymization unless that's the purpose, right? Like, then we really want to have several techniques to make sure that the identity can absolutely not be identified anymore. And then we come to anonymized data. And anonymized data is actually the deletion of those secret keys. So if you encrypt the data or tokenize the data, etc., really robustly, and you delete all those secret keys, you have anonymous data, because the person cannot be linked anymore to, the data cannot be linked anymore to the original identity, to the individual. Now, this anonymization should be still based on the current state-of-the-art techniques, as they say. And this is because in some of the anonymous data sets, there is afterwards, or with the improvement of techniques, again, re-identification possible. I work, for example, with a lot of companies with medical images. Medical images has, again, evolved a technique where from the image, the person is able to be re-identified via specific measures. So you always have to assess, and on an ongoing basis, is our data set still anonymous? The assessment should be objective, so not based on, well, but we don't know who it is. We cannot see who it is. It's the other company who has the link in the data set. That's not how it works. It should be objectively, like, because if we hack in your company or if we hack in their company, we can link the data sets and we got all the individuals' data. So this is the aspect. If you are, by the way, if you're more interested in pseudonymization and the robustness of your techniques, if you have implemented that, I have one of the freebies is relating to that later on, so that may be interested for you. A case study here that I wanted to mention that I thought we could learn from is Avas, and this is a case from 2024. Avas is a cybersecurity company, and it was selling antivirus and privacy products that you could download for free. And it was fined by the Czech data protection authorities because Avas, according to the authorities, analyzed browser trends of people downloading the packages, and then they were selling this to American business partners. And the Avas claimed that the data they were selling was anonymized because they used some patented method from the US that would remove all the identifiers. However, what Avas did was to still keep a unique identifier in their own data set. So they still had the original data set. The link was not broken. The link was not removed. And the Data Protection Authority said, well, you clearly don't have anonymized data under GDPR. Perhaps under US laws, this is anonymized data, but under GDPR, you don't have anonymized data. Furthermore, you're processing data to provide a free package, and people do not even expect that this data is going to be, they probably expect that you will do some internal analysis on who's buying your package and what they use it for, but they don't expect you to sell their identified data to the US. So that's why they got a fine based on, of course, how they set this up and analyzed and prepared the risk, well, failed to prepare the risk assessment prior to this. And now, like, it comes together then on how can we use the data then? If we have collected data, which should be collected on a legal basis, that I come in a little bit, but what does it mean to be compliant? And in a nutshell, you can say that you're compliant if you comply with the general GDPR principles. And those are broadly defined, yet on point enough. However, what it comes down to is the three most reasons for fines are if you are lawful and fairness and transparency principles being honored. So if you have legal data use and have provided the right accesses to this data, included in that with fairness and transparency and purpose limitation, there is the data subject rights, and then there is the demonstrated security of the data. Is it properly secured enough? So those are the three most reasons, the most common reasons why a company is fined under GDPR. Another one that is on number 4 and 5 is, of course, sharing data, which comes right after. And so, as I said, the legal basis is the legal reason for why you can have data. If you have data that you cannot rely on any of these reasons, please remove it. Or send it back, or don't do anything with it, don't access it. Your data, any data that you even access, must be based on one of these legal bases by law. And the first one that is very strong, but also slippery, is consent. And it's strong because if you have consent, you have definitely, unambiguously, clearly, transparently received the confirmation, yes, you can use this data for this specific purpose. Why I said it's slippery is because consent can be withdrawn. And if you didn't ask the right consent in the right way, then is it really consent? If you put it in the terms and conditions like Avas did, then the data protection authorities were like, yeah, but did you really ask it? People click terms, yes, accept terms in general. So how unambiguously and transparent is your consent? What's the scope of your consent? Have you been upfront and transparent about what you're going to use the data for? But if you have managed to tick all those boxes, you have a very strong case. Then the second is contract, and that is the scope after consent, often by your vendor, for example. You give a contract to your vendor, they operate within the scope of that contract to fulfill the purposes you've stated in there. The legal obligation is when an authority, for example, asks you to provide them data. So, for example, the data protection authorities ask you to check a claim from a data subject, from an individual, and they go inside your system, they see all this other personal data. You have the legal obligation to show this data because they are investigating a claim based on a legal, on the law. There is the vital interest reasons, for example, based on life and death. If you're going to the hospital, to the emergency room, the hospital will, in your unconscious, the hospital will check maybe your pockets to see who they can call. There is a public interest basis. This is often journalist or academic papers. And then there's the legitimate interest, which is, besides consent and contract, number 3, where companies often process data for. And that is also a very interesting basis because it's difficult to argue, and you can do a lot with it, and you also cannot do so much with it. So what is it? Legitimate interest means you have a company or a business interest, a very specific reason that you have informed your data subjects about, that cannot be asked consent for. So that is a very important part. Basically, you're overriding consent, but you have assessed the rights and the freedoms of the people to process the data that you're going to process data for. So that's why, for example, I'm always very against the cookie banners that show also legitimate interest as a bubble, because I'm happy that you inform me about my legitimate interest, but now it feels that I could give consent, but I cannot give consent. So it's very confusing and it doesn't make any sense. So a case here that is a little bit deeper and got fined heavily, but we can learn from it, is Amazon. And they got fined last year for 32 million because they were monitoring the employee performance. And they actually have legitimate interest, every company has legitimate interest to monitor or assess the performance activities of your employees to see what's the productivity level, can we improve our organization, etc. Well, what Amazon did was to actually attach a scanner to each of the employees so that in real time, every time, besides the video surveillance that were already hung above everyone's faces, but every time that a person was not labeling a product, it was shown as not productive. So it was quite intrusive. Inactivity was being reported. The authorities came to look at what's going on. It sounds quite intrusive, and indeed it was. And Amazon was fined because they didn't assess any risks beforehand. They didn't assess the rights and the freedoms of the people. They didn't assess like, okay, this is an intrusive measure. How can we make it honest and transparent and fair for all parties to still label if we don't have the bandwidth, but we need to monitor somehow our products and productivity? How can we do this in the best possible way? With lack of risk assessment beforehand, with lack of a legitimate interest assessment, and an intrusive measure just dumped on the employees, they got also a very hefty fine for this. Now, the most important thing to understand, also take away from today, is actually the roles, because there is actually also some difficulties in understanding if you're a controller and processor. And the main thing that you should do is just agree on this with the other party. Don't let it hang there, because if you're going to let it hang, mistakes are going to happen, contracts and activities are being confusing, data breaches and responsibilities and rules are happening, and you don't know who is responsible for what, and everyone will get a fine. So what it means is agree on it, state it, and the other party should agree on it. If the other party doesn't agree on it, you come to another agreement. Because what does it mean? It means just a differentiation of responsibilities and what you can do with the data. So if you are a controller, you decide, I'm the one deciding the purpose for this data, reaching out to people, getting the consent, obtaining the consent. He can still say, of course, that the processor can reach out to the people, but he decides the scope of consent, what data will be used, and he also decides the level of security. He decides that what the level of security also for the processors, they have to agree on that the type of data being processed should follow the risk assessment and the level of security that it needs for this data and the activity. The controller also must notify any authorities when it has a data breach, and it must answer any data subject rights, whereas the data processor is the one acting on behalf of the controller, act within the scope of the contract. That's why it's so important to understand the framework, and must immediately inform the controller if there's a data breach. And it must also refer any received data subject rights requests to the controller. So if you're a processor, you have, of course, your privacy notice. And if people write you on this, like, hey, I have a data subject, I want to be forgotten in your database, then you say, of course, happy to help. Please refer this to the controller. Then we assist the controller to the best of our intentions. Now, interesting also is what can you do with the data as a processor or a controller, of course. As I said, of course, a company has a legitimate interest to do some internal analysis, but then what you do beyond that is still very much depending on the contract. What is agreed? What's the scope of the consent? What's the scope of the contract? How are the purposes being communicated from all parties if all parties are working on this data? Have you collected a lot of data and you want to change the purpose? This is very complicated. Actually, consent should just be re-asked, or a very broad defined protocol about anonymization and risk assessment should be done, or perhaps you can change the purpose with a notification obligation, unless I should consult a DPO before you start there, because there have been companies fined for not doing this correctly. So I know it's possible. It has been done, but make sure you do this really, really properly, because you cannot just change the purpose. It's actually easier to just re-ask consent. For the purpose, you have a limitation. There is a further processing possibility, of course, but this should be in line within the original purpose that you've set, that you've established. And then at all times, I'm looking at the slides, at all times, communication should be clear to the data subjects, how data is being used. I had an interesting case study on this, on the roles specifically. There was a hospital in Italy who hired a data managing warehouse, and they were making data available via a so-called data mart. And the hospital had set up this consent, send it forward to all the physicians in the area who had to collect the consent from the patients to be in this Excel together with their symptoms and the names, and I believe additional information. Then the file would be embedded with a password zip. There would be put on a USB key, shared around all the physicians. It's a bit of a complicated structure. And then finally, this USB would end up at this data managing warehouse, Esther, who was the data processor. And they would pseudonymize the data, meaning remove identifiers except for one unique identifier to come back to this specific patient, and show this data for analysis purposes or requesting doctors, etc. So however it was used. However, the authorities found out of this process and said, well, we're lacking a bit of planning here, because first of all, who's your processor, who's your controller? And it was absolutely not clear if Aster was the processor. And they were also acting as such, and there was a contract, but the activities that were put on them from the contract were very broad. So then it should be very clear who is a processor, who is a controller from the contract, but also from the activities. The processor should never go beyond the controller's instructions, and also not beyond the contract. If you want to do that, ask, renegotiate the contracts, ask authorization. There was a DPIA risk assessment missing. I mean, this is pretty, I think we do not have to argue that this is very clear data related to health. So a data protection impact assessment should have been done to assess all the risks, and security measures should have been established. Sorry, my computer wanted to update. A retention period should have been established, and information to the data subject should have been provided. The hospital said they had a very clear consent, but even the authorities said, well, it's not so unambiguously clear and transparent. So this is why they were fined after all. I could have done also a presentation of only cases. I have a lot of them, but I'm going to continue with just the interesting stuff. So the data subjects, as I said, is any individual, anyone. So it also means you and me, it means your boss, it means your colleagues, it means your partners, it means your business partners, it means any individual that has some data that is being processed by another individual or company for these activities under GDPR. And they have rights, they have data subject rights, such as right to access, right to have your data in an electronic format to be transferred to another to another controller processor, right to rectify, right to not be subject to automated decision-making tools, and right to get help from a human, right to erase, to have your data erased and to be forgotten, and right to be informed or restrict or object processing. Now, I have to say, these are not absolute rights. GDPR is not an absolute right for people. And what does it mean? It means that sometimes rights can be overridden. For example, we've had cases where a customer or a company was selling products to customers, and the customers says like, oh, I don't want to pay anymore, or I don't have this membership, or whichever conflict. And then they start to say, oh, but I also heard of GDPR, and I'm invoking my right to be forgotten. It's like, yeah, that's great, but we have a legal claim open here. We have still a price to be paid. So I cannot forget you, unfortunately, as much as we all want to forget each other, but we need, some rights need to still exist. So there is, this is what I say, like, you need to assess what rights you can do. Let me show you the next slide where I explain what you need to do with data subject rights. It's pretty simple. I gave you five courses to follow. Mention all the rights that I put before on the slide. Mention all of them in your privacy policy. Explain clearly which of them you cannot comply with. For example, when indeed the price needs to be paid, we keep your data, you cannot be forgotten. Or we anonymize your data so we cannot distract you from the data set. Or we have in so much anonymized the data that we still cannot distract you. You need to ask this other processor or controller. Explain your role. Are you the data controller or data processor of this data from this data subject? And at all times, the person has the right to lodge a complaint with the supervisory authorities. This is something that is specifically mentioned in the law that must be stated in the privacy policy. I see it has been forgotten very often, but just put it there. Just put it there. And always reply to any data protection right request within 30 days. So even if you're saying, I'm a processor, please go to the controller and I'll assist you to the best of my abilities, do that within 30 days. Then at least we are safe concerning data subject rights. And then we already checked box number 2 of the 3 reasons why you most of the time get fined under GDPR. The third one, I think I said, was data security. And the so-called technical and organizational security measures means any type of measure, any type of action you're doing that you have assessed helps you to protect the data you have against unauthorized access, loss, or modification. That's all it is. And it can be anything. It can be, I have an enormously long password of 40 characters. I also have a screen in front of my computer so that no one that looks on my screen can see my screen. It can be any type of measure, but you should have them somewhere. You should list them somewhere to show that you are compliant and that you can say, this is the data we have. These are all the measures that help to prevent it from being unauthorized accessed, lost, or modified. And about that part is related to data breaches. I'll come to that in a bit. But this is what I mean. Like, I just put a few here for like a reference, but it can be many more, many others. I do not discriminate. I just want to know that you have a beautiful list somewhere that assesses these rights and how to assess that. So you do a risk preparation beforehand. So you look at, this is my data. This is what I have. What is objectively a risk for this data to be unauthorized access, lost, or modified? And then you look at the type of data that you have. Like, okay, I have it on a legal basis. It came via consent. It came via a contract. Who is able to access this data internally? How strong are those access measures? The roles, where is the data stored? Who is it shared with? Have we done an impact risk assessment? What is objectively a possibility for this, as I said earlier, the tokenization or encryption keys to be hacked? Where is there really, what's the risk? How can objectively someone access that? And how can we, objectively stop that? How can we mitigate that? And all of this type of risk, think about it, go nuts. You have an event response. That is in the end your security measures that you've set to mitigate all the risks that you came up with. This is how we've mitigated it. So yes, our data is secure as can be, because we have come up with all the scenarios, and we have put mitigation measures and security measures on top of all of them. I mentioned data sharing, and I mentioned data access. That is because actually you are sharing. If you give access to anyone else, you are sharing data. Now, of course, we have a legal entity, an internal governance in our legal entity, where we have the policies and the security measures, and we hire an employee that follows our internal governance policies. So we provide access. Under the law, sharing in the end goes to an external person. So we provide people that are under our internal governance, we provide them with access. And you have authorized access or unauthorized access, because in the end, all data should be on a need-to-know basis. Now, if you have a very small startup, for a while, you can get away that all 5 people of you have access to all the data, because you're small, you need to all figure it out together to survive. But as you grow, departments start to form. You start to create little islands with little bridges, and people need access to the data they need for their job. They therefore do not need access to, for example, HR data that has now been managed by 3 people in management. They do not need access to all the marketing list, because that has been managed by the marketing department. So access is based on a need-to-know assessment. And the need to know is based on your job activities. So how broad are your job activities? What do you need for your job to fulfill the contract? Now, when you are data sharing with a company inside the EU, let's say that company has a link with the European market, if you're both in the EU. So that company can be shared based on the data processing agreement. And this because all companies that are under this data processing agreement and in Europe fall under the same GDPR rules. The same goes for companies of which the European Commission has said those have an adequacy decision, because those data privacy legal frameworks and mechanisms are as strong as GDPR. For example, a data subject from Berlin can go to Canada and say like, hey, you have my data and I'm going to file a claim with the authorities there where you are established. So all of their measures are as strong as GDPR. In other locations that maybe they are having as strong measures, but the EU hasn't assessed them yet, other locations need to follow a transfer procedure or mechanism. And these are a little bit more intense. And that's why US is sometimes difficult, because you need to do a DPIA, you need to have specific contracts from the European Commission to be able to share this, or have another mechanism in place that allows the company to share data or transfer data from US to EU or vice versa. Now, mind you that also access is transfer. So if that person is based in the US, access the data in the EU, it's still transfer. It's seen as transfer. The last part I'm talking about is a data breach. And this basically ties everything together I've said before. What is a data breach? As I said before, it's any unauthorized access, loss, or modification of data. And this means cybersecurity hacks. It means data is lost and no backups are available. It means someone receives the purchase statement with bank information from the wrong customer. It means also a flaw in the code of a website company that means that all of the users had access actually to another portal as well. We cannot know if that actually happened. So it is a data breach that potentially could have consequences for other customers as well. Now, as a data controller, if you have a red flag that results in an incident, you have to report it to the data authorities if there is a high risk to the rights and freedoms of individuals. So if there is no high risk, given the nature of the data, the severity of the breach, what could have happened with this data. If there is no high risk, it doesn't have to be reported. If there is a high risk, then you have to report it and you have to notify the data subject. If you are a data controller and you do not know, call me. If you are a data processor, report to the data controller immediately, because the data controller has to do this whole assessment and report within 72 hours. So the hours start to tick from the moment of finding out. So from the moment you think, something is going wrong, clock starts ticking. So if you wait on a Friday, therefore don't open your email on Friday afternoon or your weekend is gone. We've had this experience. What else about data breaches? I think, yes, of course. Oh, yes, very important one I wanted to say. You actually won't get fined for a data breach itself, but for the preparedness and the response to it. So this means everything I said before. If you have assessed the risk, put in the security measures, have legal data, share it only on a contract or legal basis, then and you have prepared it and yourself, and then there is a breach and you respond adequately, there is no fine. There is a company that had a data breach with emails sent, wrong emails sent and exposed to 90,000 people, and they did not get a fine. There was a very clear risk plan before, event plan after. It was completely investigated. The breach itself was investigated. It was a standalone incident that really could have happened to anyone, but it could not have been assessed before. So if you are prepared, you've put in the measures, you've demonstrated your compliance, you won't get fined for the breach afterwards. Short recap. So indeed, here's again my, you won't get fined for the breach after. So it's true, really. You will get fined for the lack of preparedness and response. And how do you demonstrate that? With documentation, reports, logs, assessments, risk assessment. Show that you have something on paper, that you have assessed all of the events. The first thing authorities will ask out of experience is, for example, where's your record of data processing activities? With other words, do you know what data you have? Do you know how long you're going to keep it? Do you know from who you're collecting? If you have no record of anything and you have not demonstrated any documentation, and they will come knocking pretty quickly because this goes very quickly, that is the problem. You need to show something on paper that you have assessed the risks. Sit down for an afternoon, go through your records, understand what is it what we have, from who, which are the contracts, organize it, and do it again in a year. Keep it at least yearly up to date, unless there's a problem. So I reached my end, and I will give it back to Adrian. I will tell you that I made a link for some freebies where you can download and to get started understanding your GDPR compliance related to your data. I put in some personal data tags and labels, how you can assess that. The number 2 and 3 are in one Excel book. Please reach out, connect to me on LinkedIn if you have any other questions. I'm very happy to help and to answer. And I give it to Adrian. Thank you.
Thank you, Steffi. Now I will, so very informative, I have to say. I also learned a few new things today, and to be honest, I just feel more secure because I feel like, okay, we've got that part covered and so on. So what I'm
presentation alone.
Sorry?
With the presentation alone, you become more compliant.
No, I mean, you know, when it's GDPR, there is always a question, what don't I know? What don't I understand? Because I'm a data professional, I cannot deal with legal stuff. It's like accounting. I want to cry when I get into it. And, you know, I've done this in a few companies before under guidance, and now we have it here as well. So, you know, just hearing that it's the right thing, it's really reassuring.
Thank you.
So I see that there is a question from the audience. When we receive a privacy deletion request, what are our responsibilities for ensuring data is removed from our processors?
Do you know where they are on your processors? So you want to know, I think, how you know that your system has actually deleted the data, or do you want to know how to prove this to the data subject? Is there a follow-up question or not? So let me tell them both. I think that's easiest. So if you get a data deletion request, first of all, when having your systems, you should be able to find if your system is actually deleting that, meaning the systems that you're using should be able to delete it, and you should find it in the terms, and otherwise contact the help support if you haven't designed it yourself, right? So that's first of all, you should understand the tools that you're working with, and you should be able to trust that a deletion request, if you send that forward, has been deleted. If you don't know, or it's not in the contract, or it's not in the terms, double check. Second, how to prove this to the data subject. So actually, you don't have to prove this because there was no request for access. There was a request for data deletion. So you have to send a confirmation email, meaning we have deleted it from these and these and these systems, and this is how we've done so. But you do not need to show an actual empty screen because it's deleted. So you have to show that it's deleted, and this communication is a trail, an accountability trail that the data subject may rely on. So they can rely on this answer. You have sent a confirmation email, and yeah, so if there's anywhere a problem, the data subject will go to the authorities showing the email like, hey, look, they told me it was deleted, but now this data pops up there. So what happened? So that's why you need to have your records first straight, right? Like, where have you shared the data? Has it been deleted from all the tools? Have you also in the past used another newsletter tool? Go there to see if they also have deleted the data. So that's why we should have this accountability tool in ourselves to understand, okay, all the tools, are they deleting the data? Send a deletion request, you get the confirmation, you can confirm it to the data subject, it's deleted from all of these tools.
Sounds good. There's one more question for which I guess I have some answers as well with my slides that I will show soon. So from an engineering perspective, what are the best practices to ensure that personal data from processors does not return via ETL? So for example, what Sarah mentions is a customer's email coming back into the database via syncing Zendesk history. So like a ticketing system.
So they're flaws. Exactly. So they're how we should like prevent the flaws in the system that we have designed. Yeah, this I'm a lawyer, so indeed I do not answer the technical questions. I just give the answers of like how it should be under law. And under law, as I said before, like if there is a flaw in the code and it gives a certain access to people that they shouldn't have access to, this could be a data breach. So that's why beforehand, you should try to test it. Make sure that you have assessed these risks, like, okay, does the tool work? And then and how to give more insights, I'm gonna let that to you for the solutions on a technical level.
So just to answer the question directly, I think from my perspective, I would treat, first of all, anything that seems like it's PII as being PII, and I will just not ingest it into the data warehouse. I think we call this minimization, right? And basically, there will always be a risk that the agent types in something in the free text field, right? And basically, any free text field, we can kind of treat it as a possible danger, because if we don't have control over what is in there, there could also be PII. And there are actually multiple, let's say, companies that are building solutions for detecting PII in unstructured data. I don't have a good answer for you here. I would say those companies also have a success rate, right? So there's no perfect solution, kind of. But for something like an email, you can detect it quite easily. It's easy with some regex or something like that.
I have the pseudonymization and data tag label assessment. So not from a technical point of view, but actually manual, I made a template for you guys, an assessment where you can first establish what's the data that is personal data that can be related to a person. What do we have? What do we do with it? Are we keeping it? Is there a pseudonymization technique we can perform? What are the risks related to that? So look at the link that I just shared. I think Adrian can share it again. But for understanding on a manual level, like, okay, this is what the tool should do. This is the personal data we have. This is what it should do. So that's how you can use it.
I will reshare the links afterwards. Now I'm just going to quickly go through our slides.
Yeah.
So at DLT, we do some things to help with GDPR compliance. And first is the open source offering. So what you can do with this, there is a little demo here. I will send around the slides and you can visit it. And this demo shows you some implementations of anonymization, pseudonymization, minimization. It also shows you, for example, like maybe you have an API on which you are not sure if things might change. Like maybe your customer service team is adding a new field in Zendesk and it's PII. So for example, you can set with DLT a data contract to prevent any new fields that are unknown from making it into your database. And then you can, when something changes, you can have a look at what it is and decide from there. I will share out these slides on email afterwards. So you can check out the demo on your own time. We also have a commercial offering. So these are quite early versions. We're working also with some partners for this. So the first paid product is what we call Search and Secure. So it's basically something that detects your PII. It keeps an eye on if PII appears in your data. So for example, maybe now there's some Zendesk data in your free text, PII in your Zendesk data, and PII data contracts. So while normally you have data contracts on fields, here you could have data contracts on PII information. So if PII is detected, we reject it or apply some kind of policy to it. We also have another paid product, which is more about generating the documentation. So a lot of what you do technically leaves a huge technical trail. And when you use DLT, we basically keep track of a lot of metadata, how your data flows. If you have annotated PII, we know where that ends up. And we can essentially generate all kinds of documentation for GDPR purposes of how, let's say, this information is treated, where it's coming from, including, depending on, let's say, technical systems, access logs. So like I promised, it would only be a couple of minutes of a pitch, and that's all about my slides. I will send them around. You can access the demo. It's a collab notebook. And if you're interested in the paid offering, you can contact our sales team. So that was all. Thank you very much, Steffi. And I see you again in 1 week for the HIPAA compliance webinar.
Yeah, thank you so much as well for having me. And Thanks, everyone. Great questions. Hope to see you guys again in a few days.
Thank you and have a nice evening.
Have a nice evening. Bye.
Bye.